You can't think your way out of trauma. Somatic therapists acknowledge that there is a meeting place between psyche and soma, mind and body, and bring my own understanding of how scary it can be, actually, to lose our sense of trust in self and the body, and to be kind of ruled by a body that is on high alert. The body is primed to protect us. If we are in a position
Welcome back to Live Into Your Brilliance, the place where we dig deep to find the experiments and the insights that help you come back to the brilliance that you are and live lives that you love right now. As always, I'm joined by my brother from another mother in Boston, Mark Billows-Bilby. How are you doing, my friend?
I am well, my friend. Thank you. Lovely to see you on the other side of the screen, because we were together last week, which was amazing because we held our third co-founder, founder / CEO retreat in beautiful New Hampshire, which is the second time we've had it in New Hampshire, and it was lovely. We had 6 founder / CEOs, wonderful human beings, and we had a remarkable time. So yeah, I'm glowing after that, but I'm even more excited about our guest today.
Yeah, no, me too. So it was almost the perfect preparation for this conversation. So we're delighted to have Sienna with us. So Sienna Richardson is a somatic therapist, educator, and strategic consultant. And her work sits really at the kind of intersection of trauma recovery, well-being, and embodied leadership. She has a huge amount of experience in mental health and trauma-informed care, and is really interesting spaces that she has worked in, from working with the US military to designing and working with the Pig Hotel Group in creating their wellness experience, which actually was identified as the Times, I think, as the #1 or the best wellness experience in the world, which is really, really cool. So I just, from my first conversation, I know that Sienna brings this really wonderfully grounded, compassionate presence to all the conversations she has, and I just can't wait to see where she's going to take us on a journey of discovery today. So, Sienna, you're very welcome to the Live Into Your Brilliance podcast.
Thank you so much for a warm and beautiful introduction. I feel very grateful to be here. So thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I guess you know where we start because you and I chatted, and I know that you've got some ideas as to where you might take us, and I'm sure the listener is going to learn more about you as we go into the discussion. So I'd love to just dive straight in with, what is the thing that if you could whisper it into the ears of everyone on the planet right now, that you think, oh, if they could just hear this clearly, it could really change everything for them? What is either their biggest insight, or it might be something that you'd like to blow up that you would love to share with us as a starting point?
It's such a brilliant question. And I think there's so many ways to answer. I think I have been reflecting on it a lot, and there's a universal truth that I have experienced and also that I witness, which is when we are held, we can hold more. Really simple. When we are held, we can hold more. And I chose that because I think it is a good framing for a discussion which I imagine might explore what we mean by our wellness and psychological health, and also what I think a therapeutic space can offer, which is somewhere to put down perhaps some of the responsibilities that we carry in our day-to-day so that we can tend to the parts that need tending to. which is not easy to do in our busy, demanding lives. So I think I'd start there. When we are held, we can hold more.
And Sienna, I got to admit, I had to go and look up what is a somatic therapist. And I believe it stems from the Greek word soma, which means body. And so, unlike a traditional sort of cognitive therapist, you're fascinated by what we store in our bodies and what our bodies remember from the experiences we've accumulated. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant summary. And I think just to build on that, firstly, you're not alone in terms of Googling what that means. And I think it's fair to say that it's an emerging field, although its roots are not new. So just to acknowledge that somatic therapy is a broad umbrella term with roots in body psychotherapy. And I guess to build on what you said a little bit, somatic therapists are trained to foreground the experience of the body. There's a quote that I love, which are thoughts are the language of the mind and feelings are the language of the body. And I think for the most part, we have limited literacy around our embodied experience. And somatic therapists acknowledge that there is a meeting place between psyche and soma, mind and body, and that we can use the body and the information that the body shares with us to explore psychological material. And for me personally, that feels like a very rich playground and one that is mostly untapped. So I often say that somatic therapy is working with the nonverbal cues or the nonverbal communication. That's not to say there isn't talking, because of course we do talk to make sense of our experience, but we're really trying to foreground less of our cognitive narrative storytelling about the content of what's happening, but instead, how are we feeling and how is what we're experiencing in our life showing up in our body to help us make sense.
So, if I may, I'm gonna jump right in the deep end because I'm fascinated by what you've said and also what you sent through. Because one of the lovely sort of prompts that you sent through was this concept that the body can be a difficult place to call home, and I'm not too sure what you mean by that, but my interpretation of that, and you've heard, if you've listened to this podcast, Al and I are great believers that we have this wonderful built-in gift in the form of feelings, and it's sometimes quite hard to say to somebody, like, there's no such thing as a bad feeling. A feeling is simply a warning system that says, hey, perhaps you're carrying something and you're attaching to something that isn't allowing you to live from that place of peace and love and calm. And so when you're overwhelmed by feelings, and if feelings truly are the experiences of your body, I can imagine that the body is not a cool place to call home. Like it is, like, and there are all sorts of physical manifestations of that discomfort and disconnect with the universe that I think people may really, really struggle with. So I'm really keen to get your insights on that. And if I'm way off base, then please, by all means, get me back on the path.
I don't think you're off base. I think you are spot on. I think, I guess the sentiment to recognizing that the body can be a difficult place to call home is because the body can be unpredictable, and it can also it can present feelings that, let's be really real, can have a profound impact and sometimes negative impact on our lives. And also feelings direct behavior. And I think that's really key to understanding. I think for the most part, we have a limited tolerance to feelings that we define as difficult or bad. I think we have much more appetite for joy and feelings that fill us with all the good hormones. I think culturally we have less availability, capacity, understanding to sit with actually what can be a big portion of our lives, which is experiencing things that are challenging. And I think there's a tipping point between feelings that offer some discomfort but are transient to feelings that are consistent that lead to suffering. And there is a difference. And I think that our capacity, firstly, to even understand what does this feeling mean, if we think about feelings simply as messages that we can either attune to, respond to, or not. We can do the opposite, which is to ignore or to push down. The thing is, they don't dissolve on their own. They get louder. And when some of my work has been working in mental health services and clinical settings, and I think it's fair to say that in those settings, the feelings that the patients are experiencing are having a profoundly directive and damaging impact on their lives. And so that's when we can get really into real hot water, because we then start trying to find ways to manage. And that's the beginning of addiction, or the roots of leaning into them behaviors in an attempt to soothe difficult feelings. So there's a difference between day-to-day feelings that are uncomfortable or things that don't go our way, to consistent feelings that can have a profound impact on our lives and our health and our relationships.
You said something a second ago, and I wanted to go back to it, because before moving forward from what you said, that we have a limited capacity or understanding for difficult feelings. And I was just curious, are they the same thing, or is it different? Like, is it that we have a limited capacity, or is it because our lack of understanding kind of directly leads us to believe we haven't got the capacity? Because you were talking about that and the kind of transient difficult feelings, but then more persistent ones that can then lead us to want to soothe those feelings, or if I've understood that correctly. Yeah, I just wanted to come back and go, gosh, do we have a limited capacity for difficult feelings?
I think it's a brilliant question, Al, and I think for me they're connected. There was some research that was done by Brené Brown, and they were trying to understand what our general consensus of understanding is for emotional literacy. And most adults acknowledge that they're either happy, mad, bad, or sad. It was really limited. And their research conducted, or they identified through their research, that there's actually 52 different emotions that we can experience. And I think even for me, if you asked me to sit down and acknowledge 52 feelings, I'd probably struggle to get them all, right? And so I think on the whole, we have quite a limited understanding of feelings, and also why they're there or what the purpose of them is. So if we have a limited understanding, then that will impact our ability to then be with them or work with them or respond to them in ways that can be helpful. We are also complex. So we have big umbrella terms like grief. Well, grief can capture many, many different feelings and emotions. So it's not easy to decipher necessarily what we're feeling and why and what we need as a result. We're definitely not taught how to do that if I think about traditional schooling. So I think we've got a long way to go, and they feel connected to me.
Mm. Yeah, I think about when people even just ask that simple question of how are you feeling? Or, if Sean, my wife, says, oh, there's something up, like, what's up? And actually, sometimes it's just so hard to even articulate it. So you tend to brush it off because you've no way of articulating it beyond maybe some of those rudimentary, like the happy, mad, bad, or sad, So, because I'm imagining then, based on what you said, the people that you have worked with are folks who find themselves in a situation perhaps where they have been struggling to deal with or cope with their feelings, and then that takes them on a route that's not serving them in their general day-to-day lives. And I don't know if this is a good time, but I would love to know what is available there, and how much of this is also linked back to that insight you put at the table right at the beginning, which is, when we are held, we can hold more. And I was super curious about the first part of that, because I thought, what does it mean to be held, and where does that fit in with this language of feelings and our capacity to be able to, I guess, cope with or even thrive with difficult feelings?
There's so much there. What does it mean to you, Al, to be held? What comes to mind?
Oh gosh, I didn't want you to push this back onto me, Sienna. Um,
There's
what does
no
it mean for me
formula.
to be held? Yeah, I don't know. Like, what came to mind first was, um, is that about, being compassionate with the self? Like, just actually, that's what came to mind for me. Was it like a level of self compassion and kindness, and like, actually, I thought about it as me, how I hold myself, like whether I hold myself with kindness and compassion or not, and depending on that, probably is a dictator as to the level to which I have the capacity to hold life. Um, that's what came to mind for me when you said it at first. Interestingly, it also made me feel slightly uncomfortable, and I don't know where that comes from. Not just because you asked me the question, but even when you said it, I was like, "Oof, what is that? What does that mean?" And my body didn't reacted with a bit of energy of some description to the sentence.
Right. And I love that you shared that, Al, because you're you're speaking to what the process of somatic inquiry is, right? Which is you were just exploring something, or you heard me say something and you had a response. And that is happening all the time, all day long. We're not always present enough to catch it, but you just did a beautiful job of noticing and then being able to put words to it. And if we were in a session together, there might be space to unpack it a bit more or explore it. But I think your reflections are really, really beautiful and meaningful. And I guess the truth is that we all can define what it means to be emotionally held. If I think about it and how this connects to feelings, if we think about an example, that probably all of us have experienced at some point in our lives, which is that we share how we're feeling, which could be uncomfortable. Say we're feeling angry or frustrated, and someone says, well, you don't need to feel that, just calm down. Right? That doesn't feel that feeling is being held. Right? Another thing that we see often with children is that when children cry, we respond with, no, 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 don't cry. Right? We're often, even well-intentioned, stepping over each other's feelings, or we're trying to move someone from something that's uncomfortable to something that feels more pleasant or easeful. And the truth is that we can only accompany someone in the depth of their uncomfortability as far as we have traveled with it within ourselves. Right? So when I think about being held, I do think about my ability to hold myself. But I also know that when life has really taken its toll or brought me to my knees, that my ability to hold myself gets limited. And so we need wider systems of care, which could be anything from a loving partner to a friend that we trust, to a family member, to a therapist, or whatever form of support and resources available, to hold an open, compassionate, to use your word, space where we can then be with some of the feeling. Does that make sense?
So just to unpack that a little bit, let's take the example of a therapist. Not you. I'm saying a cognitive therapist who emphasizes more of the talking it through rather than and the work on the psyche rather than soma. So you can cognitively wrap your head around your trauma or whatever's gone on, your experience. But unless you're holding that space, to your point, where the feelings are given airtime, you're still effectively a prisoner to that trauma, because cognitively and logically you've unpacked it, but your body hasn't aired it. Is that right?
I think that's a brilliant summary. I think everybody's journey is different. And for some people, talking therapy might be enough to process trauma or disturbing psychological events. For the most part, and definitely in the work that I have witnessed and also my own journey, my understanding is that you can't think your way out of trauma. Right? We are meeting today on this very autumnal day in 2025, but also what is in the room with us is our entire embodied and psychological history. It's quite an extraordinary thing when we think about it, right? And that material gets moved. And if it's not held and if it's not processed, it can start to manifest in either behaviors that cause further harm or physical symptoms that can feel quite abstract. I think if we just think about anxiety as an example, again, it's quite a broad umbrella term, but it can manifest in many, many different physical forms. And my sense is that we can cognitively make sense of some of our experiences. For some people, that might be enough. But to your point, actually, the body can have a jet lag response. So even as we've grown and developed and might have some kind of cognitive understanding of some of the things that have happened to us, that doesn't necessarily translate to the body. And it doesn't necessarily translate to an easeful, integrated, harmonious life. The body is primed to protect us. And if we, even with all of the cognitive understanding, if we are in a position or we're in a situation that mirrors something that has once caused us harm, the reality is that the body will start giving us warning signs. So I think there's no hard and fast rule, but I guess my work and my sense is that cognitive sense making is only one part of recovery and healing and thriving ultimately.
Sienna, you mentioned your journey. I'm just like, you seem well. Obviously, you've done you've done the work. Is this, for you to get to the point where you are? Is this a process that you've gone through personally, and it's kind of brought you into the work, or did you come into the work and then start to really see this? I'm just kind of curious about your route here.
Sure. It definitely started with me. And I always say to clients that I'm never asking them to do something that I haven't done myself. And I think we all find our way to work that feels meaningful in various forms. And for me, this definitely wasn't the career path that I discussed with the high school career pathway counselor. I was very much on a totally different trajectory, actually. And I think I've ended up doing this work because I've definitely been sparked by my own curiosity and my own life and areas of challenge, and also a great sense of compassion for existing in a body that was a difficult place to call home. If I jump back to what I said, I can give a little bit of context that maybe sets the scene a little bit. I was raised in a loving household that placed a lot of value on family and on education. And I also grew up in a household that was emotionally and physically unstable. And I had some early childhood and adolescent experiences that had a profound impact on me and fractured my sense of safety in myself, in relationship, in the world. And that's a really important understanding, because I was also at an age of development. And I think when we're developing and our sense of safety becomes fractured or even ruptured completely, we start to move through the world differently. And that was definitely my experience. And I can look back now and recognize that because of that, my actions, and this is something that I feel so inspired by in the human spirit, the way that I was trying to manage that fracture was to seek regulation or soothing in areas that ultimately were not helpful. And I think all of us sit on some spectrum of leaning into behaviors that aren't helpful in an attempt to soothe or just de-stress. You know, we have kind of trauma at one end of the spectrum, and then we have stress management at the other end of the spectrum. And the impulse to soothe is a really intelligent one. That's actually a sign that our body is working. We are always trying to move ourselves back to equilibrium or to a sense of regulation and safety. But we'll often do that, and I definitely did that, by means that are not helpful. And when you work in a mental health service, you see that people are leaning into alcohol, drugs, sex, relationship, tech addiction. I've also worked with leadership executives who would say that they've kind of self-soothe by being exceptionally busy and filling every second of their day and not being in touch with what's present for them. And I think, there's a question which I love, which is the addiction, the problem or the solution? It's an interesting question. What do we lean into to soothe? And is that the problem or the solution? And I think it's probably both often. But all that to say, I became really curious in myself around some of the things that I was doing that definitely didn't feel like they were bringing me ease or soothing long term. Often the things that we lean into are quick fixes. By the time I was 21, I went sober, so stopped drinking. I definitely look back and think there was a part of me that was seeking or was curious about finding a better way of living and existing. I had a sense that something was definitely very wrong, or that I was wrong. And at some point early in my 20s, I met someone who became one of my best friends and still is now. And her mum is a therapist. And she had suggested to me that I try therapy. And at that point, my thoughts around therapy was that you sit on a chaise longue and it's all very awkward. And I just had no idea really what to expect. And I did find a therapist. I don't know how, but I sort of stumbled into a room with a therapist and I had a terrible time. And I just thought the myths that I thought about therapists were actually confirmed. It was really awkward. It felt really cold and uncomfortable. And I left that setting actually feeling exceptionally anxious. And I was experiencing periods of quite severe dissociation where I would lose contact with myself and body. And I know now that experience happened because I was touching on material that was being suppressed. And that therapist, although they were kind and warm, hadn't read the cues in me that were present around me needing to be paced in the room. And so instead, I started kind of opening myself up in a setting where I wasn't really ready to do that. And I definitely didn't have any skills to transition home and take good care of myself after the session. So that was the kind of beginning and end of my therapy journey at the time. But I kept finding my way to some different forms of practice, yoga, mindful yoga, meditation, which I can see now were all practices that were offering me some form of respite from the internal distress that I was feeling. And somewhere along the way, I was introduced or referred to a body psychotherapist. And when I got into the room with that therapist, who I then went on to work with weekly for 5 years, I had a totally different experience. And that therapist was able to recognize that my nervous system was in a lot of distress, and that before we could go towards any psychological sense making, we first had to start to give my system the reference point of being safe. And that was the basis of that work. And that is the basis of trauma recovery and trauma therapy as well. So I always think I came in left field because this wasn't my first career choice, but it has become the work that I have then trained in and bring my own understanding of how scary it can be, actually, to lose our sense of trust in self and the body, and to be kind of ruled by a body that is on high alert and not being able to thrive, or not being able to even function at times very well. So I have a huge amount of compassion, and I guess my training has followed my personal inquiry.
Mm. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Yeah, like I find that first part, your first therapy experience, I guess really interesting, because I have someone in my life who I think would really love to unlock themselves. I can't think of a better word, so I'm just coming up. That's the word that comes to mind. But they've got the number one thing is that this would be the language that they would use. I don't know what I would say. Like, they don't actually have language and so they have a fear of talking to anybody. And then, your first kind of therapy experience, in one sense, I also think kind of is super interesting, in the sense of someone new who's thinking, gosh, I know I need something, but I don't know what it is. And I don't know where to go. And I don't have a language for what's going on. And so I'm super curious as to how you would um, guide someone like that, or what advice would you give to them, or to anybody, to the listener who might be listening, going, "Oh my goodness, yes, like I feel this, and there's something here for me, but I don't really know what to do with it."
It's a really common experience, I think, Al. I think to the listener, I would say you can shop around. I think I had no idea at that point. I think I was about 21. I just thought, oh, that's therapy, and that's not for me. And so I had no understanding that there is obviously endless approaches to therapy, and there's also endless therapists. And actually, we have the research now that suggests that actually it's the relationship with the therapist that matters way more in terms of outcome than the actual therapeutic modality, which I just find fascinating, and I think says a lot actually about our relational experience and our ability to really be alongside someone at a time of difficulty and potentially suffering. So to the listener, I would say there is an endless array, and you are well within your right to just have introductory calls and suss out, and also in that process to listen to your body. Because if we just take it out of a therapy setting for a moment, we all know when we meet someone where we feel there's a sense of warmth and connection and vibe, and we just can have a sense of being able to be ourselves. And we all have the experience of meeting other people where it's maybe more jarring and there's less connection available, or we feel more defensive. And so we're already attuned to that. It's the same thing if we're looking at any type of therapist or practitioner. The same goes for if you're having a massage. So trust your instinct on it. I think to the person who is perhaps, or I guess a lot of people that I have worked with would say, I can't do this work because I feel disconnected to my body. And I guess my starting point is, let's talk about what it feels like to be disconnected from your body. I'm not trying to force connection or to join up dots where there aren't any to be joined up just yet. So I would be thinking about, whatever this something is, can we have a sense of what is it that you want to change? Because if there's something that we're exploring the need for support around, it's probably because there's something that's not feeling so great. And if we don't know how to name it, I really view that as part of the exploration, and to kind of work with the stuckness as opposed to trying to unstick it. It's like, what does it feel like to not know how we feel? That's quite a significant starting point that I think many, many people can relate to. Definitely my history means that some of what I was experiencing was a dissociative episode. Well, I had no language for what that was. I do now because I've learned, but I didn't feel feelings. I felt numb. I felt empty. I could have been that person that said, I don't have anything to say. I don't know how I feel. I think it's really common. But I would start there. That's my feeling.
I've shared on this podcast that my wife, Vanessa, went through a period where she couldn't get off the couch for 5 months. And she would wake up every day and she was in floods of tears and deeply depressed and anxious, more anxious, I think, than depressed, but I think they went hand in hand. And it was interesting because she had done the work. Like if you had sort of kept a scorecard, you would have been like, oh, she's done the cognitive therapy work and she's kind of really tried to lean in and do that. But then her body just literally shut down and she couldn't stop it. And there was nothing that she no amount of talking or anything helped that. It literally shut down. And her weight dropped down to 110 pounds. And I mean, you could, it was scary. It was super scary. And so, and we were very lucky because we had amazing support, and eventually she understood that it wasn't about talking it through. It was about observing her breath. It was about observing what it meant to be present and observing her thinking without engaging with her thinking. And then she suddenly saw enough of a gap to kind of start to turn the nose up, and then she could eat again, and she was, she could start that journey back. But I share that because I think what I saw, and also, I mean, being a typical guy and probably a little just naive, you're like, oh my God, I can solve this. Like I can, let's talk about it and solve it. And the overwhelming message was just shut up and hold my hand. And just the physical act of holding her hand literally every day for, I would say, at least 3 months of the 5 months was, she will say that was like the best therapy for her, was just to have that physical contact while she was doing the other stuff. But the reason I bring this up is because and I'm sure there are listeners who have loved ones, or maybe even they have experienced this themselves. When you're in that situation and things are shutting down, you are so desperate. It is so hard to see beyond the words. It is so hard to see beyond this spiral downwards, you can't actually perceive what it's like to operate on the other side of it. And so my question for you is, when you're facing somebody who's in that dire situation and the trauma has now manifested through your physical form in a way that is creating this inability to operate, how do you even start with the process of seeing it for what it is?
That's an extraordinary question. And I feel very moved by what you've shared and your wife's experience, but also your example of being alongside her. And it's really our innate response, I think, is to wish or to will things to be different. Right? Because nobody wants to see someone that we love who's suffering. And I think there are times, there's a term that I like where we can describe life turns us into a starfish. Like we're just starfish. We cannot do anything but lie down and bow down to life.
Like
And
that.
we have
I like the analogy. I don't like what it means, but yeah.
No. Well, what it means is what you're naming, which is that sometimes the tidal wave of there's a tidal wave that takes us over and under. And anyone who has experienced grief will know that there will be lots of people that will lean in to offer support. And some of that support will be really helpful. And some of the support will be wildly unhelpful, which are things like comments like, in time it will be easier. Or there's a tolerance for holding someone in grief. And then there's a tipping point where we kind of want them to get up and move forwards. And I think that the starting point for me, and it's a really, really difficult starting point, is that I have no timeline. And I'm not trying to move or usher or steward someone along on any kind of timeline. One of my closest friends experienced a tragedy at the start of this year. And I was with her in the really early days of that unfolding. And I had this sense of knowing, which is this is a lifelong process of grief now that she will have to endure. And so despite how unbearable it has been at times to see her suffering, my work has been to continuously show up, to be alongside her, whilst also not losing sight of an alternative reality. Because when we are lost in the kind of vortex that trauma can pull us into, we lose perspective. And we also lose all sense of there being a way out and through. I operate from a position of great trust that our body is always trying to move towards surviving and ultimately thriving. So as long as I am part of creating the right conditions for that to happen, one of which I think is a very, very simply, as you described beautifully, to hold the hand of someone where they are. Actually, that in turn means that they can start to be with their experience and it can move, or it can change shape.
Right.
But that's not easy. It is to kind of with a friend or with a client, which is to just kind of sit there and say, we're going to be here as long as it takes. And I'm up for that. And I'm not on a timeline. And I know that when I've been on the receiving end of that, that has actually brought me some level of comfort, that there isn't an expectation that I somehow have to get myself up and together and move forwards before I'm ready to. But not easy to do. And let's face it, also not very, that's not very compatible with the demands of life as well. So
Yeah.
I also say the demands of the body are sometimes wildly incompatible with the way that we have set our lives up. And so, that's not easy.
No, well, I mean, Al and I always joke because the universe saw fit for me to quit my job about 2 months before she needed me there full time. So the universe knew it was coming. We just didn't know it was coming. And so it was, it worked out. But thank you for that insight. I've got another interesting case that I just wanted to put to you, just because I don't know if you've sort of seen something similar, but a friend of ours has a super talented daughter who is a great swimmer, and she'll probably end up representing her community at the Olympics. She lives in a small island community, and but she had to have some surgery because she was getting this sort of pain, and I think what ultimately happened is they put her under anesthetic and they removed I think it was a rib that was causing some issue for her as a high performing swimmer. And the surgery went very well, and the doctors were very happy. And during her recovery, all of a sudden, she noticed that she couldn't move, and she became paralyzed. And it took her 9 months to learn to walk and fully function again. And all of the medical experts who were involved in the procedure could not explain it. I mean, there was no nicked nerves, there was none of that. And the closest explanation was, at some point, maybe she had woken up during the anesthesia and during the procedure, and she was in some kind of trauma and her body was shutting down. But it was the most bizarre case. And I just wonder if that just resonates with you in terms of what actually, our body is capable of doing to protect us, I guess, in many ways. What even we don't understand it, but there's this level of protection. But then, to your point, then there needs to be the recognition that just then whatever's happened needs to be held, and you need to allow the time for that to kind of come through. But yeah, I just wanted to put that on the table because I'd never heard of anything like that, but it was the most bizarre thing.
Yeah, it sounds like an extraordinary experience. I guess my position is that we make sense even if we don't understand. So I think there are obviously parts of our experience that are all of it, the mind, the body, none of the information that we have is fact, right? Everything is theory. Nothing that I'm saying is fact. Nothing that we hear from any author or researcher. Everything is theory. Everything is perspective. And I think there are things that are unexplainable And so that's a really difficult place to be. I've worked with people that have had quite severe somatic manifestations or symptoms, but they have no psychological understanding of why that might be the case. And there's no physical reason why that might be the case. So, I've worked with people who are in a place of great confusion. And I guess my position is always that we can only work with the information that we have. And there is some information that is being presented. So how do we not, how do we get okay with not understanding, or not even needing to make sense of something, just to recognize, okay, this is what's happening in my system right now. And is there any information here that might nudge me towards the next step in my recovery, healing, insight, awareness? I don't know that answers your question, but I guess I feel that we're often working with unanswered questions. And I think we really want to be able to understand and tie things up neatly. And we just can't always do that. Why does one person experience something that could be deemed as traumatizing and it inspires them into growth, and their response is to fight and to grow, and another person experiences the same thing and moves into a state of collapse and confusion? I think these are big unanswered questions, and I don't think that they lie in therapy. I think they feel like bigger questions around, why are we here, and what's my personal philosophy that helps me survive this earth school and the many challenges that it throws at me.
I never heard that expression before, but I really like it. To survive, to my personal philosophy, to survive earth school. I didn't quite catch it, Bill, as for whatever reason, I didn't quite catch some of what you were sharing. But it strikes me in listening to you, Sienna, and the word that came up for me was acceptance. We spent a week last week hanging out with some really cool folks, and having some great conversations. And as part of that, we could really see, but it was kind of obvious, just what you said about like how we all can have different experiences of different things, some explainable and some unexplainable. But at times, what was also true is, or seemed obvious, is like our collective desire to try and save each other from each other's experiences. Particularly if it was difficult. And I guess, yeah, I'm just curious, like, how much of this is comes back down to acceptance of like your own life journey, and then having an appetite to explore it from there. Because it seems to me that like that there's something there in this like in the desire that we have to, I guess, not experience difficulty and so on. It's counterintuitive. Whereas actually, if we can accept our experience and then explore it for ourselves, that becomes that, at least that seems to be becoming clear to me, is that it's all an exploration, and there's many, many ways round the mountain to kind of learn more about just like who we are, how we work, and that question of why we are here. And yet it doesn't seem to me that there's a huge proportion of the population that uh, are perhaps either interested in doing that or willing to see it as a lifelong journey. And I guess I'm curious as to how you see that, and what's your invitation to people if they really want to have I guess, which we all do to a degree, a more I don't know if like whether it's a better experience of life. I'm not a big fan of the word better. But at the same time, I think we're all in search of this kind of experience. And yet it doesn't seem to me that very many people are up for being lifelong students of this in this school of earth. So I know I've kind of rambled a lot there. I'm kind of curious around how much of this is acceptance and how much of it then is a willingness to see it as a lifelong schooling in order to know thyself.
I love talking about acceptance. I sometimes share this story in my early seeking years. I think I must have been about 24 at this point. I took myself on a meditation retreat that was 3 weeks, which I had dabbled in meditation. I definitely didn't have a consistent practice, but I was in this point of part of my life where I was seeking. I was seeking for something to feel better, really simply. And on day 4 of that, I was packed up. And I was like, peace out. This is awful. I feel worse than when I got here. I had all these expectations of being on a meditation retreat and thinking that by day 4 I'd be in some blissed out state. And it was the exact opposite. I was more stressed. We were sleeping in dormitories and I'm a really light sleeper, so I wasn't sleeping. And I just thought, this is the worst meditation retreat out there. And I packed up my bags and went to the teacher and said, I'm going home. And I was speaking to the back of his head because he was turned away from me. And he turned around really slowly and said, okay. And I was like, what do you mean? Okay. I thought he was going to try and persuade me to stay. And he said, it's not a prison. You're free to go. Like, go. But his okay shocked me out of my own frustrated state. And I said, aren't you going to try to get me to stay? And he was smiling, which just frustrated me even more. And he said, sit down and tell me what it is that you're finding. Well, tell me why you don't want to be here. And I just went into this ramble, which was, I hate the food. I can't sleep. Everyone's waking me up. We're in meditation from 5 a.m. till 10 p.m. And I've got things that I feel like I need to talk about. And I feel more stressed than when I got here. And I thought I was going to be feeling, I went into the whole thing. And he was just kind of quietly nodding and smiling. And then I finished speaking and he said, Sienna, the practice of meditation is to not be in resistance to what is. And it was like a whoa moment where I was like, oh, that it's not to be blissed out. The practice of meditation is to be in acceptance. And it was such a wake-up call for me, because obviously what he was highlighting is that I was in resistance to literally every single moment that was causing me more frustration. And anyway, I picked up my bags, went back to my dorm, and I did stay for the 3 weeks. And I've never forgotten that moment, because he crystallized something to me that then became so clear in all areas of my life, which is, when am I in resistance and when am I in acceptance? And there's a fine line with acceptance, because we can't get to that by skipping over the feeling, right? We need to be able to feel the edges of life and the experiences that really take us over, actually. But there is no benefit to staying in an experience lifelong, which only leads to suffering. And I think if we think about 12 steps as a program, and there's parts of that I don't feel connected to, but actually one of the things that I think they have done an extraordinary job of consistently doing in the framework is that step 1 is about surrender. And I don't know any other mental health program that starts there. And I actually think it can be a really helpful starting place, which is I surrender to what is. That does not mean I accept it. I think we have a misunderstanding that acceptance means something is acceptable, and that is absolutely not the case. But surrender and being with what is, I think, actually is really fundamental to healing. Actually, there's more I could say, but I feel like I've been speaking for a while. But it feels like a really meaningful discussion to me to think about where are we in resistance and where are we in acceptance.
Mm. Yeah, I think that might even be if we ever manage to lure you back on for another deep conversation. It sounds like we could go into the whole topic of acceptance. But it is interesting that the first part of the 12 steps is surrender. But like if I heard you right, it's like surrender and explore from there. And we often talk about the come from being so important. If you like surrender or acceptance it's very settling. And like you said, it doesn't mean you're accepting of, like, acceptance means that everything you have to accept and just live with everything as is. But there's a whole different flavor to the exploration from there, because you're not trying to get away from anything. You're not trying to fight anything anymore. You're like, okay, I accept where I am. I accept what is. And now I'm really curious to find out what's actually here for me. And I was just thinking back of my friend and probably that. I just think that is the first stage. It's just like to stop resisting, and I think that's challenging for people. That's challenge. I think it's challenging for everyone, me included. I'm not talking about other people. It's just getting over that feeling of resistance to the difficulties that show up. And I guess that comes back to the very first sentence that you put in. The level to which we're held. When we are held, we can hold more. And I guess it comes back to that. It just feels very, very all very linked up.
Yeah, and I think there's something that I'm seeing a lot more recently is this idea of, or the terminology is trauma release or emotional release. And for me, there's a real misunderstanding in that type of terminology, which perpetuates this really seductive idea, actually, that we can release or expel parts of our experience that are difficult, challenging, the things that we'd rather push away. And my experience, both personally and working with people, is the hard truth of what we're just talking about, which is actually we can't undo what's been done. Part of recovery is starting from that place, that this is where we are, and how do we, instead of releasing or rejecting parts of our experience by splitting them off, how do we sit with the really hard truth that we can't undo them? And instead, how do we integrate them? How do we hold them? How do we hold all parts of ourselves that get split off by difficult experiences, so that we're operating from an integrated place of wholeness and acceptance for all that we've lived through? For me, that feels like trauma recovery, not this idea of trauma release. And it feels really connected to what you just said, Al. You just made me think of that.
I realize that we've come to the end of the allotted time, but one thing that I'm really bummed that we haven't got into, so this is like a thinly veiled invitation to come back and do part 2 with us, is because you made an interesting comment just now about, it's quite interesting, like the 3 of us have arrived on this call with all of our lived experiences, and Al and I often say 13.8 billion years of evolution had to happen for the 3 of us to sit here at this very moment doing exactly what we're doing. And so that really begs the question, as somebody who specializes in somatic healing, how much of it is making people see that they are actually connected or a vital part of this like massive living system, the consciousness of the universe, and that flowing through us in terms of the various physical manifestations and our sense of being held and what it truly means, to be held in the context of that. And so I would love to, and I'm sure that is another hour of fascinating insight, but if you could give us like a teaser for that session, what would the teaser be? Because I would love to have that conversation with you.
What a brilliant question. I think if we recognize that we have always been drawn to the unanswerable questions, and or humans are innately drawn to the ocean, to look up at the stars. And I think that when we can connect to something bigger than self, or when we find perspective, very literally find perspective, it can inform our sense of perspective, and that we are ultimately never alone. But we live in a very individualistic culture that severs our connection to nature, community, life force, actually, in lots of ways. My work with the military, and maybe this is the teaser, has been rooted in nature. We work in a 300-acre estate of nature. That work is not happening in clinical settings. It's happening in the forest. And that is in the knowing that when we connect to something greater than ourselves, it can facilitate our connection with self to deepen. And I feel very, very strongly that the work, that connecting to awe, wonder, sense of other, for me, that philosophy and perhaps a connection to spirituality has been definitely the North Star in my own recovery, because I don't think we can make sense of it or hold it on this kind of human level. Some of the things that we experience beyond sense making. So how then do we lean into the wider system and mystery to perhaps be able to better navigate things on an earthly plane, if you want to frame it that way? But for me, it feels really central to my work and definitely to my own sense of philosophy. Ultimately, we're on a rock flying through space. That is an extraordinary concept that I think can help place some of our challenges to to a greater backdrop that sometimes allow us to hold it more easily.
Well, if that isn't the best teaser out there, I don't know what is. So part 2, here we come.
I would love that. Thank you both so much.
Sienna, we do have our closing tradition, which you may have picked up from if you've listened to prior episodes, which is to invite our guests to also create their bumper sticker for life. What would Sienna's bumper sticker say?
I think it would say, "You make sense. You make sense." And I say that in the hope that it offers some compassion for the human experience. And that even if we don't or can't make sense of our experience right now, there's always good reason behind our underlying behaviors. And for me, that sentence feels helpful. That I'm not I'm not a version that was created with a misstep. I'm human, and our challenges are universally shared. Actually, one of the gifts of being in a mental health service is that you listen to people's stories. And when you do that day in, day out, you realize that there's much more that connects us and separates us, even if the nuance of it is unique and personal. So, you make sense would be my bumper sticker.
I love that. Sienna, if people want to find out more about you, connect with you, or learn what's on offer, where can they go? And
Amazing. So you can email me just at hello@iamsienna.com, or head to my website, which is www.iamsienna.com. Easy.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all of those in the show notes as well, so that if anybody wants to, and I'm sure there will be people who will want to go and explore some more, can do. From my side, before I'll pass over to Billows, thank you so much. It's been an awesome conversation, just a wonderful exploration. And if anything, like Billows has kind of asked for the teaser and the trailer, there's so many places that you've kind of just, I feel like, peeled a layer back off that I'm super curious to dig deeper into myself. So thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. It's been amazing.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
Billows,
Yeah,
any final
thanks.
words from you?
Yes, Sienna, thank you so much. I can't believe that we've had like 70, almost 80 minutes. It's like it's flown by, which is always a great indicator that you've just been involved in like the best conversation. And I just love your wisdom and your insights. And I'm absolutely intrigued by what you just teased us with, because I think finding out about how you have connected and found the link between the cognitive world, the therapy world, the spiritual world. You've blended all of that, and then the use of this 300-acre site and the work you're doing with the military and some of the insights from that, and just exploring that whole concept of us being part of something much bigger, I think is really exciting. So I can't wait to have you back, and I hope you come back. I hope we haven't scared you off, but I do hope you come back and spend some time with us, because I know that certainly on a personal level it would be incredible, but I'm sure our listener is also thinking the same thing. So please come back, and thank you so much.
I definitely will. I've absolutely loved speaking with you both. And I think often these conversations and the conversations that I've listened to with your guests and other podcasts, they leave more questions than answers. And I think that's a really good place to end. So thank you for your thoughtful questioning, and I can't wait to come back.
Awesome. No, thank you, Sienna. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for tuning in again. We hope that you have, I hope you have found some questions and also some answers in this exploration. And regardless of what you've seen or what you're feeling, just remember, you make sense. And as always, go forth and live into your brilliance.